Brazil today is the rising giant of South America, but also a strangely unconvincing one. On paper, it has almost everything: a huge territory, over 200 million people, massive natural resources, and a seat at every important table from G20 to the BRICS. Yet, when we ask, is this a true global power on the level of the great players, the answer is still not quite. Why? Well, let's start with a key concept that explains this ambiguity: multi-alignment. Brazil has chosen a strategy often called active non-alignment or multi-alignment. It wants good relations with the United States, with China, with Europe, with Russia, with the global South, and it refuses to fully pick a side. This gives Brazil a lot of flexibility. It can sell soy and iron ore to China, attract investment from the US and Europe, sit with BRICS, and at the same time talk about democracy and climate in Western forums. But flexibility is not the same as leverage. When a country never clearly commits, it also struggles to extract real concessions from the big players. Both Washington and Beijing know a simple fact: Brazil depends more on them than they depend on Brazil. How does this dependence work in practice? Economically, China is Brazil's top customer. It buys enormous quantities of Brazilian soy, meat, iron ore, and other commodities. Without that market, Brazil's trade balance and many rural regions would suffer heavily. On the other side, the United States and Europe are still crucial as providers of investment, advanced technology, financial markets, and also as security partners and political references. So, when the US-China tensions rise in trade, technology, or finance, Brazil is squeezed. If Washington restricts technology to Chinese partners, Brazilian projects tied to Chinese companies feel the shock. If Beijing retaliates with tariffs on or shifts imports, Brazilian exporters feel it too. Brazil is a large, but in this game, it is a more exposed rule taker than rule maker. But economy is not everything. Culturally, Brazil still lives under strong US soft power. Hollywood dominates cinema screens. American series and music define a big part of urban culture. US platforms host most of the digital debate, and Brazilian elites maintain dense links with US universities and think tanks. This shapes values, lifestyles, and even how politics is imagined. On top of that comes the evangelical factor. Evangelical and Pentecostal churches in Brazil have built a capillary organization. Tens of thousands of local congregations, their own TV networks, radio stations, newspapers, and social media ecosystems. Many of the largest denominations and leaders have learned from and are deeply connected to US evangelical culture. This matters geopolitically. Look, for example, at their stance on Israel. For many evangelical leaders, support for Israel is not a matter of classic diplomacy, but of religious prophecy, very close to US evangelical Zionism. Or take the Amazon. Regulations to protect the forests are often attacked from evangelical pulpits as obstacles to God-given prosperity, echoing US culture war narratives where environmentalism is framed as left-wing globalism. So even where Brazil formally pursues an autonomous foreign policy, part of its public opinion is shaped by cultural and religious currents that originate in the United States. So where does Brazil actually have leverage? One central field is climate and the environment. Brazil holds roughly 2/3 of the Amazon rainforest, one of the world's biggest carbon sinks, plus immense freshwater resources and one of the cleanest electricity mixes among major economies. Because of this, global climate targets are almost impossible to meet without Brazil. Another area where Brazil is trying to turn potential into power is the sea. The South Atlantic is home of its offshore pre-salt oil fields and key shipping routes, and Brasilia wants to be seen as the natural security provider for this space. With French help, Brazil has been building a modern fleet of submarines and is working on its first nuclear-powered attack submarine. Underneath all this, though, lie two deep structural problems: demography and premature deindustrialization. For decades, Brazil enjoyed the demographic dividend, a big growing workforce and relatively few elderly people. That phase is over. Fertility has fallen below replacement level and the share of older people is rising fast. The country's growth is still ongoing, but it is already facing rising pension and health costs and a slower growing labor force. At the same time, Brazil's industry has shrunk before the country became rich. Manufacturing's share of GDP has dropped over the last decade, while the economy shifted towards commodities and low productivity services. Economists call this premature deindustrialization. The factories thin out before a strong high-tech or advanced services sector takes their place. So Brazil is in a paradox. Just when it needs money and technology to climb up the value chain and support a bigger geopolitical role, its easiest engines of growth, a young workforce and a strong industrial base, are weakening. A good short phrase here could be: Brazil is getting old before becoming mature. It is aging before it has fully turned its scale into first-tier industrial and technological power. But this picture on its own would be too deterministic, almost fatalistic. There are three important counterpoints to this. First, the aging shock is real, but it is gradual. The most dramatic rise in the share of elderly people will happen after the 2040s. That leaves 1 or 2 decades in which Brazil can still reform. Second, global megatrends actually fit Brazil's strengths. The world is looking for clean energy, critical raw materials, secure food supplies, and fresh water. Brazil has all of these: massive renewable potential from hydropower to wind and solar, agricultural capacity as a top food exporter, enormous biodiversity, and vast water reserves. Third, geopolitical maturity is not only about income per person. Brazil has become very active in foreign policy, in BRICS, in climate diplomacy, and in coalitions of the Global South. So, how to close this picture? Brazil has, in many ways, squandered part of its demographic and industrial window. It now risks aging before it becomes rich and technologically advanced. And its multi-alignment, while elegant, often brings more flexibility than real leverage. Yet, the story is not finished. There is still a closing strategic window tied to the energy transition, to food and water security, and to the reform of global institutions, in which Brazil can transform its sheer scale, its resources, and its diplomatic activism into durable geopolitical weight. If it uses the next 2 decades to invest in productivity, reindustrialize in a greener, higher-tech way, and consolidate its role as a climate and global South leader, then the rising giant of South America may finally become a mature power. If not, Brazil will remain what it has so often been called: the country of the future that never quite arrives.